The Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel stood ominously against the night sky, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat. Beneath its glamorous facade lay decades of dark secrets, whispered among locals but never spoken aloud. Celebrities had come and gone, but some never left. Paranormal sightings and strange disappearances plagued the hotel for years, but nothing ever reached the public. That is, until the most recent deaths, brutal, unexplained, and horrifying. Agent Ethan Quinn stared up at the towering building, a sense of dread gnawing in his gut. "It's just a hotel," he muttered under his breath, though he knew better. His team had been sent by the government to investigate the increasing number of disturbing deaths, each more gruesome than the last. The official reports labeled them as accidents, but they didn't fool anyone in the paranormal division. As they entered the lobby, a blast of cold air hit them, though it was a warm summer night outside. Agent Natalie Brooks, tech expert and skeptic, glanced at the thermostat. 85 degrees my ass, she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. The receptionist barely acknowledged them. Her eyes glazed over as though she'd seen things she wished to forget. "Room 214, she said mechanically, handing over a single keycard. "That's where it started." Dr. Marcus Voss, the team's paranormal scientist, frowned. "Started? What started?" The receptionist's lips trembled. The screaming, it started in that room. They said the walls were bleeding. No one else in the lobby reacted to her words. The few guests seemed to move like ghosts themselves, their eyes hollow, their footsteps slow. Ethan exchanged uneasy glances with the others. This wasn't just another ghost hunt. This place was wrong, and they all felt it. As they ascended to the second floor, the elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors opened, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. Room 214 was at the end, the air growing colder with every step. Shadows seemed to twist and writhe on the walls, as though they had lives of their own. When they reached the door, Ethan's hand hovered over the handle, hesitation clawing at his chest. Natalie stood behind him, her tech gear buzzing faintly, detecting something. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. Ethan unlocked the door, and as it swung open, the smell hit them first, rotting flesh, metallic blood, and something ancient. The room was dark, save for the soft glow from the streetlights outside. But the walls were moving. Rivers of blood oozed from the cracks in the plaster, crawling down like veins. And then the whispers began, soft at first, then louder, filling the room with voices that weren't their own. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Ethan spun around, but the door wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," he said, his voice barely masking his fear. The room's temperature plummeted, and then, from the corner, something began to crawl from beneath the bed. Something not quite human. A figure crawled slowly out from under the bed, its limbs twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. The dim light caught its skin, gray and leathery, like something that had been dead for years. Its face was gaunt, eyes black pits of nothingness, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "Jesus Christ!" Natalie gasped, backing away, but her feet refused to move fast enough. Her equipment buzzed wildly, the signals going off the charts. This isn't possible. No way something like that exists. But it did. The thing's head twitched unnaturally as it crawled closer, dragging itself across the blood-soaked carpet with disturbing speed. Ethan's instincts kicked in, drawing his firearm, but even he knew it was useless. Bullets wouldn't stop something like this. "We need to leave now," Dr. Voss barked, his voice strained as he fumbled for his holy relics. But there was no exit. The door was locked, and the windows were sealed shut, trapping them in this nightmare. The crawler stopped, its head cocked to the side, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. And then, in a sudden burst of movement, it lunged toward Natalie. She screamed, barely dodging as it barreled past her, slamming into the dresser with an otherworldly shriek. The creature twisted on the floor, its limbs jerking violently before it began to rise, standing on its two legs, towering over them. Its fingers were long and clawed, dripping with blood that was not its own. Voss frantically chanted something in Latin, brandishing his cross, but the crawler's grin only widened, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. It moved closer, undeterred. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and from the walls, More shadows began to pour out. Crawlers, more of them. Dozens. Their figures were barely distinguishable from the dark, but the stench of death filled the room as they emerged. They moved with unnerving speed, their distorted bodies clambering over furniture, crawling across the ceiling, circling the team like predators. Ethan's pulse raced. "Get ready to fight!" he yelled, raising his weapon. But before he could take a shot, one of the creatures lunged at him, its claws slashing through his sleeve, tearing the fabric and skin beneath. Natalie screamed again as another crawler grabbed her ankle, yanking her to the floor. Voss tried to pull her back, but the creatures were relentless. This wasn't a haunting. It was a slaughterhouse. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into total darkness. The darkness in the room wasn't just an absence of light. It felt alive, pressing in on them like a suffocating blanket. Ethan's flashlight flickered on, its beam barely cutting through the thick, oppressive air. The crawlers had vanished as if they were never there, leaving only the cold silence in their wake. "We can't stay here," Natalie whispered, her voice shaky. Blood trickled from the gash on her ankle where the crawler had grabbed her. "Whatever this is, it's playing with us." Ethan nodded, breathing heavily, his heart racing. "We move." Now, next floor is the old theater. They exited the cursed room, the hallway outside eerily silent, the flickering lights above casting long shadows. As they ascended the stairs to the hotel's historic theater, a chill ran down Ethan's spine. Every creak of the wooden steps echoed like a scream in the stillness. The theater was abandoned, yet its eerie beauty remained. The velvet seats were coated in dust, the screen hanging like a decaying canvas. Ethan's light swept across the room, revealing figures frozen in place. Mannequins dressed in old Hollywood garb sat scattered across the front row, their blank eyes fixed on the empty stage. "What the hell is this?" Voss muttered as they entered, eyes darting between the faceless mannequins. "Are they part of some ritual?" Suddenly, the projector flickered to life, casting an old black and white film on the screen. The images were haunting, a glamorous party at the Roosevelt laughter dancing. But the people on the screen weren't acting. They were screaming, running, something chasing them just beyond the frame. The sounds of their terror filled the theater. As the film played, shadows on the screen seemed to shift, morphing into grotesque figures. Crawlers, skinwalkers, and worse. The figures grew larger, creeping toward the edge of the screen, until they weren't just shadows anymore. "They're coming out," Natalie whispered, terror creeping into her voice. The shadowy figures began stepping out of the screen, their movements slow but deliberate. These weren't mannequins or apparitions. These were the souls of those who had died in the hotel, twisted into monstrous shapes, ready to drag the team into their world. "Run!" Ethan shouted, firing his gun at the nearest shadow, but the bullets passed right through it. The shadows were already upon them, their cold, skeletal hands reaching out. Natalie screamed as one of the shadow creatures grabbed her by the throat, pulling her into the blackness. The others fought back, but the shadows moved like smoke, evading every blow. Just when it seemed like the darkness would consume them all, the screen flickered off, and the theater was still. Natalie collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, the shadow retreating back into the screen. "We need to get out of here before it starts again," she panted, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan helped her up, the eerie silence deafening as they rushed out of the theater. But the real terror was only just beginning. The team burst out of the theater into the hotel's courtyard, their nerves shattered, breaths ragged. The once grand space was now deserted, overgrown with weeds and consumed by decay. A single spotlight illuminated the pool, the water stagnant and murky, reflecting a distorted version of the world around them. "Where's the backup?" Ethan demanded, scanning the perimeter for signs of the rescue team they had called in earlier. But there was no sign of life, just the eerie quiet, broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "They should have been here by now," Voss muttered, checking his radio. "Static. Nothing but static. We're alone." Natalie, her face pale and trembling, pointed to the edge of the courtyard. "What is that?" Ethan turned, his heart skipping a beat as he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the pool, its form shifting and unnatural. It looked like a man, but its movements were wrong, too fluid, too animalistic. It was a skinwalker, its glowing eyes locked on them with predatory intent. "Don't make any sudden moves," Voss warned, clutching his relics tighter. "Skinwalkers can mimic voices and faces. It's probably already one of us." The creature began to circle the pool, its body contorting in ways that defied logic. One moment it walked upright, the next it dropped to all fours, crawling toward them with an inhuman grace. "Everyone stay together," Ethan ordered, his voice low but firm. But as they began to back away, another rustling came from behind them. More figures emerged from the shadows, twisted, deformed versions of people they had seen earlier. The hotel's cursed energy had drawn in these creatures, and now they were surrounded. "We can't fight them all," Natalie whispered, panic creeping in. The skinwalker's voice echoed through the courtyard, mocking them. "Where are you going? The party's just begun." The thing lunged, its long claws slashing at Ethan, barely missing him as he ducked out of the way. Natalie screamed, backing into the murky pool, her body trembling with fear. Another skinwalker appeared on the opposite side, snarling as it approached. Ethan fired his gun at the closest one, but the bullet did nothing. The skinwalkers were too fast, too unnatural. The creatures closed in, the group backed against the edge of the pool, the water dark and foreboding behind them. Without warning, the water began to ripple. Something moved beneath the surface, something large and ancient. They had nowhere to run. The water in the pool churned violently, as if something massive stirred beneath. Natalie's foot slipped on the slick tiles, and she nearly toppled into the murky depths. Ethan grabbed her arm just in time, pulling her back. "We can't stay here," he growled, eyes darting between the approaching skinwalkers and the boiling water. "We're trapped." Voss pointed to the pool. "There's something down there, something worse than those things." His voice quivered, his usual calm slipping. The skinwalkers advanced, their twisted bodies moving unnaturally, jaws snapping in anticipation. Their eyes gleamed with malevolent hunger as they flanked the group, ready to strike. And then, with a sickening gurgle, the water erupted. A long, sinewy arm broke the surface, its blackened skin slick with slime. It slithered up from the depths like a monstrous serpent, its fingers long and bony, tipped with jagged claws. It wrapped around the leg of one of the skinwalkers, dragging it into the pool with a splash. The creature thrashed wildly, hissing and screeching as it was pulled under, but it was no match for whatever lurked below. For a moment, the group stood frozen in terror, watching as the water quickly stilled. The other skinwalkers hesitated, their predatory instincts disrupted by the unseen threat beneath the surface. Ethan seized the moment. "Now, run!" He pulled Natalie to her feet, and they bolted for the courtyard exit, Voss trailing behind. The remaining skinwalkers snarled, but they kept their distance from the pool, their eyes darting nervously between the humans and the black water. As the group stumbled through the narrow passage that led to the hotel's upper floors, a horrible, echoing screech came from behind them. Ethan dared a glance over his shoulder. The water churned again, but this time something much larger began to rise. A hulking, shadowy figure, impossibly tall, its eyes glowing a sickly green. It was the shadowman, an ancient spirit, far more powerful than any ghost or demon they'd faced before. The ground trembled beneath them as it stepped out of the water, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. The shadowman reached out, and the air around it warped with a suffocating pressure. The skinwalkers screeched and scattered, their bodies bending and contorting unnaturally to flee from the creature's presence. But the shadowman wasn't after them. It wanted the team. They burst through the door leading back into the hotel, slamming it shut behind them. Ethan pressed his back against it, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" he panted, his heart pounding in his chest. Voss's eyes were wide with fear. That was no ordinary spirit. That thing, it's ancient. Something tied to the very foundation of this place. "Great!" Natalie groaned, leaning against the wall. Blood trickled from a fresh gash on her arm, but she barely seemed to notice. "So we've got skinwalkers, a shadowman, and something in the pool trying to kill us. Perfect." Ethan scanned the hallway. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. The hotel seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. "Where's the rescue team?" They should have been here by now. Voss checked his radio again, still met with nothing but static. We've lost contact. They could be anywhere. Suddenly, a faint crackle came through the radio. Ethan snatched it from Voss's hand, bringing it closer to his ear. Rescue team, come in. Do you copy? The response was garbled, barely audible over the static. But there were voices, panicked, distorted voices. Help trapped, can't get out. It's coming. Then silence. Ethan's stomach twisted. They're trapped somewhere in the hotel. We have to find them. Natalie shook her head, her face pale. Are you insane? We can barely keep ourselves alive, and you want to go deeper into this place. We don't have a choice, Ethan shot back. If we don't find them, they're dead. Reluctantly, the group moved forward, the narrow hallway stretching endlessly before them. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in and out like the hotel itself was alive. The air grew thick, making it harder to breathe with each step. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves in another wing of the hotel, the once ornate decor now faded and crumbling. The doors lining the hallway were slightly ajar, and the faint scent of decay wafted through the air. Natalie pointed toward the end of the hall. Look, a faint light flickered from one of the rooms, a sign of life, or at least they hoped it was. Cautiously, they approached the door, its number barely visible beneath layers of grime. Ethan pushed it open, and what they saw froze them in their tracks. The rescue team was there, but they were twisted, their bodies contorted into unnatural positions, faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. They were alive but paralyzed, their eyes wide and pleading. The shadowman stood in the corner of the room, watching them with a cold, indifferent gaze. Before anyone could react, the door slammed shut behind them. The door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, trapping them inside with the shadowman. The room was suffocatingly small, the air heavy with the stench of decay and fear. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his gun, but deep down, he knew bullets would do nothing against something as ancient and malevolent as the shadowman. Natalie let out a small whimper as the twisted forms of the rescue team remained still, their frozen expressions of terror locked in place. They were alive, but not alive. Paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. Their eyes, wide and wet, pleaded silently for help. The shadowman didn't move. It merely stood there, watching, its glowing green eyes piercing through the darkness like knives. The dim light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The air was thick with malice, and Ethan could feel its weight pressing down on him, as though the room itself was slowly trying to suffocate them. "Get us out of here," Natalie whispered, her voice trembling, eyes locked on the figure. Ethan knew they were running out of time. He could feel something pulling at his mind, a creeping numbness that threatened to overtake him. His thoughts became sluggish, like wading through quicksand. This was the shadowman's power, a slow, torturous drain of their will to resist. Voss, however, was already at the door, fumbling desperately with the handle. "It's locked. It's not opening," he gasped, panic rising in his voice. The shadowman took a slow step forward, its movements barely perceptible, but filled with an overwhelming sense of doom. Each step sent a jolt of fear through their bodies, as if their souls were being pulled toward the black void it carried with it. Natalie staggered back, her eyes darting toward the paralyzed rescue team. "They're still alive," she choked out. We can't leave them like this." But there was no saving them. The shadowman had already claimed them, and it was ready for more. Ethan glanced around the room, his mind racing. There had to be a way out, something they weren't seeing. The walls began to ripple, the edges of the room blurring as reality itself seemed to warp. The shadowman was distorting the space, bending the very fabric of the hotel to trap them forever. Suddenly, Voss let out a desperate shout. "Look, the window!" It was their only chance. Without thinking, Ethan lunged toward it, crashing through the glass. The world outside exploded into shards of darkness and wind as they tumbled through, leaving the cursed room behind. But as they hit the ground, Ethan knew the shadowman wouldn't let them escape so easily. It was still coming. They landed hard on the cracked pavement outside the hotel, gasping for breath. The night air was thick, humid, and smelled of rain and rot. Ethan's body ached from the fall, but there was no time to linger. The shadowman's presence clung to them, pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Keep moving," Ethan barked, pulling Natalie to her feet. She was trembling, but alive. Voss stumbled behind them, his eyes wide with the same dawning realization. The hotel wasn't going to let them go. They hurried toward the back of the courtyard, past broken statues and overgrown hedges. Beyond the grounds loomed an ancient structure, an old chapel abandoned and decaying. It seemed like the only place left to hide, though even that felt futile against the malevolent force that hunted them. As they neared the chapel, the air grew colder. The wind howled, but not with natural force. It carried whispers, faint, mocking voices that seemed to call out their names, promising eternal suffering. Natalie stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide in terror. The moon. Ethan looked up, his stomach sinking. The moon, once full and silver, had turned blood red. Its eerie glow cast everything in a sickly hue, deepening the shadows and making the night feel even more oppressive. Voss swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't natural. It's a ritual. We've walked right into it." "Ritual?" Ethan repeated, his mind racing. "What kind of ritual?" "Blood moon rituals," Voss said shakily. "They're ancient, tied to sacrifices and gateways between worlds. The shadowman, it's been building up to this." The hotel groaned behind them, as if in agreement. The earth beneath their feet vibrated with dark energy. Suddenly, the courtyard burst into life as figures emerged from the darkness. Twisted, deformed bodies that had once been human, but now served the dark forces at play. Crawlers, skinwalkers, and worse, converged on them from every direction. The blood moon fed their strength, making them faster, more ferocious. Their grotesque forms snarled and hissed, moving with unnatural speed, claws gleaming in the moonlight. "Into the chapel," Ethan shouted, but as they raced toward the crumbling structure, a piercing shriek split the night. One of the creatures, a skinwalker, lunged at Voss, its claws tearing into his side. Voss screamed in agony as he fell to the ground, blood pouring from the deep gashes. The creature reared back for another strike, but Ethan emptied his clip into it, the bullets doing little to slow it down. "Leave me," Voss gasped, his face pale, blood pooling around him. But Ethan refused. "Not today." He grabbed Voss by the arm, and with Natalie's help, they dragged him toward the chapel as the creatures closed in, their savage cries echoing under the cursed blood moon. The doors of the chapel groaned as Ethan and Natalie pushed them open, the sound echoing like a death knell. Inside, the air was thick with dust, cobwebs clinging to every surface. The pews were overturned, and a rotting altar stood at the far end, draped in decayed velvet. Candles flickered weakly in the dark corners, their dim flames barely piercing the oppressive darkness. Ethan and Natalie dragged Voss inside, his face pale and slick with sweat, blood soaking his clothes from the deep gashes inflicted by the skinwalker. "We need to stop the bleeding," Natalie whispered, her voice shaking, but Ethan shook his head. There was no time. The creatures were right behind them. They pushed the heavy doors shut, the thud reverberating through the hollow chapel. But it wouldn't hold. Outside, the creatures prowled, their distorted bodies slithering and scraping against the ancient stone walls, eager to get inside. Their growls and hisses filled the night, the blood moon casting a sinister glow through the broken windows. Ethan scanned the room, searching for anything that could help. There has to be something here. Anything. The chapel wasn't just a place of worship. It was a prison, a sanctuary designed to trap something far worse. Voss coughed weakly from the floor, his breathing ragged. "It's all connected. The shadowman, the creatures, they're all part of the same ritual. How do we stop it?" Natalie demanded, her eyes wide with terror. Voss grimaced in pain, his voice barely audible. "The altar, it's the key. The shadowman was summoned here. We can send it back." Ethan's gaze snapped to the decaying altar, a feeling of dread settling in his stomach. "You're saying we have to complete the ritual? That's insane." But there was no other choice. The creatures outside began pounding on the doors, their claws scratching deep gouges into the wood. The doors wouldn't hold much longer. Natalie grabbed Ethan's arm, her voice shaking. "If we don't do something, we're dead." Reluctantly, Ethan nodded. They moved toward the altar, Voss's weak instructions guiding them. The air grew colder, thick with the presence of the shadowman. Its malevolent gaze bore down on them, unseen but felt in every corner of the room. As Ethan and Natalie placed their hands on the altar, a violent tremor shook the chapel. The candles blew out, plunging them into darkness. Outside, the creatures howled, their rage intensifying as the ritual began to unfold. But it wasn't going to be that easy. The shadowman materialized, its massive form looming over them, eyes glowing a sickly green. The ritual had awoken something far worse. The air around the shadowman crackled with energy as it stepped forward, its form growing more solid with every second. Ethan felt the cold seep into his bones, an overwhelming dread that made it hard to breathe. The shadowman was no longer just a specter. It was real, tangible, and deadly. Voss groaned from the floor, too weak to move, but his voice cut through the chaos. "Finish the ritual. You have to complete it." Natalie scrambled to find the old tome Voss had brought with him, its pages yellowed and worn. Her fingers shook as she flipped through it, eyes scanning the ancient text. The creatures outside were relentless, slamming their bodies against the chapel doors, which buckled and cracked under the force. Suddenly, the door splintered, and a crawler's grotesque arm forced its way inside, claws scraping against the stone floor. Ethan fired his last bullet, but the creature barely flinched. They were out of time. Natalie found the passage in the book, her voice shaking as she began to read aloud the ancient incantation. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unnatural, as if they didn't belong to this world. The shadowman hissed, recoiling slightly, but its presence only grew stronger, feeding off the fear and chaos around it. The ground beneath their feet trembled, cracks snaking through the floor as the chapel groaned under the weight of the ritual. The shadowman's eyes burned brighter, and with a deafening roar, it surged forward, its massive arm reaching for Ethan. But just before its claws could tear into him, a blinding light exploded from the altar. The ritual had worked, partially. The shadowman screeched in pain, its form flickering violently as the light engulfed it. But it wasn't enough to banish it entirely. It lashed out, its dark tendrils wrapping around Voss, lifting him into the air. His scream echoed through the chapel as the shadowman began to consume him, draining his life force. "No!" Natalie cried, but it was too late. Voss's body withered in seconds, his soul torn from him, leaving only an empty shell. With a final surge of energy, Natalie shouted the last words of the incantation. The light intensified, blinding them all. The shadowman howled, its form disintegrating into the air, but not before leaving a final, haunting whisper. "This isn't over." The creatures outside fell silent, their connection to the shadowman severed. The doors sagged open, revealing the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. But as Ethan and Natalie stood in the quiet aftermath, they knew the curse of the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel was far from broken. The shadowman would return,